I think if we have time, I hear the robots thing come up all the time. So I think if you don't mind, I would like to address that. I think for a lot of people that'll be like the common sense objection, like, well, then we're just robots. So and then the manipulation, we can't go into the detail, but if you can just kind of sketch
Yeah.
the response. So
Okay.
that'll probably be all the time we have for those types of objections.
Okay, so that sounds good to me. The robot objection, by accepting your challenge, I'm going to be accused of taking the low-hanging fruit, so that's fine with me. I want to take it, but I take the robot and pets and puppets to be far the weaker of all of those conditions that I've used, and I take the manipulation one to be the strongest. So we can do the bookends, the easiest and the most difficult, and if I tackle a little bit of both, I won't be accused of taking the easy ones.
Yeah.
But the answer actually for both of those has the same structure. Like I said, they're arguments by analogy, so the way that you respond to them is by unpacking a little bit what's the claim here. Right? Here again, we're talking, like, just phrase the dialectic correctly. It's an argument in favor of incompatibilism. So it's a positive argument to establish that determinism and moral responsibility are not compatible with each other. And so it's an argument for which the burden of proof is on the shoulders of the incompatibilist at this point. And so if you take the argument from Luther and from Edwards that I mentioned earlier, that's where the burden of proof is fully on the Calvinist, and he's trying to explain and demonstrate that compatibilism is true. But now, for the manipulation and the robot argument, we are fully on the side of having the burden of proof for the incompatibilist. So what do they need to convince us that incompatibilism is true? What they do is they use the analogous case, and then they make one of two claims. They must either claim that the situation in which we agree we are not morally responsible, they must say that situation, either it has a relevant similarity with the normal case, or a stronger claim is there is no relevant difference between the two. And so either of those, if they can demonstrate that, that's successfully showing that we shouldn't be morally responsible if determinism is true. But there are two different routes. So I've called them, there's the mild argument from analogy and the bold argument from analogy. So the mild version is the one that simply says there's a relevant similarity. So the normal case of compatibilism, determinism is relevantly analogous, is relevantly similar to that condition. So now we're talking about either the robots or the manipulation or the coercion or whatever. So that's an existential claim to say there is a relevant similarity. And what is a relevant similarity? A relevant similarity, in our case here, is going to be a property of the case where we're not morally responsible, right? So a property of the robot or of the manipulation case that excludes moral responsibility in that case, and is also present in the normal case of a determined human being. Right? So you can see that if we have one of those, then it follows that we should not be morally responsible on determinism. If there's a property of that case that explains that that removes moral responsibility, and we also find it in the other, then that would remove it in the other case. The difficulty in shouldering that burden of proof is that we're rarely told what is that similar property. What is it that is present in this one that entails that we are not morally responsible, and that is also present in the other? One natural candidate, usually when we compare those two cases, is going to be to say something like, well, we don't have the ability to do otherwise. Like he doesn't have it, we don't have it. So depending on how you phrase that's alleged similarity, you're going to very quickly find yourself in question-begging premises, because you're going to say, well, the thing that was removing it is something that actually is determinism. Well, if it's determinism to begin with, then we haven't made much progress by using the analogous case. All you have is the presupposition that determinism does the trick, that it removes moral responsibility. But whether determinism removes moral responsibility is the very question that we're disagreeing on. So that mild version of the argument by analogy is pretty hard to do. And typically what you find is a turn to the bolder claim, which is to say there are no relevant differences. Right? So now this is no longer saying there's a property in my case, example case, and I'm going to trace it to the other one. It's going to say, look, there's got to be something in my case where we all agree there's no moral responsibility. And you can't find something that's different in your determinist case that would mean that now it's okay for us to be morally responsible. So he's saying there's no difference, there's no relevant difference that you can point to. Okay. So if that's true, once again, I think the argument is successful, because if there is no relevant difference, then we should be excused in both cases. Now, the difficulty is, how are you going to sustain that objection? To say like there is no relevant difference. It's a negative existential claim, right? So you're saying like none of the properties that are different are relevant. It's going to be hard to convince me of that, to run down all the properties of your case and of the determinist normal case, and to tell me none of them are relevant, and to convince me that they're not relevant. All right. So in facing that bolder version of the argument by analogy, the compatibilist has two responses to make. The first one is to still say that it is still question begging, right? Because technically, I haven't been pushed to accept that there are no relevant differences, and I'm waiting for you to convince me that there are no relevant differences. But beyond mere skepticism like this, to say simply, you have the burden of proof and I have not been convinced. Now, on the bolder claim, you actually have the opportunity as a Calvinist to go on the offensive and not just leave the matter as a question of burden of proof and to say you've not been proven, you've not proven it, you are begging the question. Now you can go even on the offensive and say, no, I'm going to prove that your premise is false, that there is in fact a relevant difference. So if you can do that, then you've done more than just saying the argument is question begging, even though I think the argument is question begging. But you can also show, yeah, but no, actually I refute it. So to refute it, you could provide a property that's a relevant difference. So now here again, what is a relevant difference in our case? That's going to be a property of the case that we agree excludes moral responsibility. So a property of the example that excludes moral responsibility, but is not present in the normal case of determinism. That would be a relevant difference, right? If you identify something that excludes moral responsibility in the example case, in the analogous case, and you show that it does exclude moral responsibility, but it's not present in the normal case of determinism, then that's it, you have a relevant difference. And if there is a relevant difference, then it's refuting the claim that there are no relevant differences. Okay, so now it's the big question in each of those cases, can the Calvinist identify that relevant difference, right? And so in each of those, in my work, I try to offer something that I think is quite convincingly the relevant difference, while having preceded all of that by saying, look, I don't even have to do this technically. I could just tell you your argument is question begging, but I'm going to go ahead, stick my neck out, and offer to you some candidates that I think are relevant differences, which would go beyond just mere skepticism and refute the argument, the bold argument by analogy. So in the case of the robot, this is why I was saying it's kind of the weakest, the low-hanging fruit. It's trivially easy to find a property of the robot that excludes moral responsibility, but is not present in the normal case of a determined human being. And here it's simply the fact that the robot does not have self-consciousness, right? So uncontroversially, the robot is not self-conscious. Right? Uncontroversially, if you're not self-conscious, you cannot be morally responsible. So we all agree on that. And uncontroversially, human beings are self-conscious. So we have all those three ingredients that I said are the signature of a relevant difference. None of them are controversial, and so that refutes the argument. That's the Calvinist is very consistent, is able to consistently say, look, robots are not morally responsible, and we are, and there's a very good reason for that, is because they're not self-conscious, so they can't be morally responsible. Stop bothering me with your robots claim. Okay, so that's for the low-hanging fruits. Now, I did mention others. Maybe I can just briefly give you my candidate for a relevant difference. You have the coercion argument. So here again, lots of things to say, but I think at bottom, what I offer as the refuting relevant difference is the fact that coercion in the analogous case entails the presence of physical force or threats. So again, there's discussion about what coercion actually is. There's controversies about definitions. All of that I go into my book. But at bottom, I think that you need physical force or threats to count as coercion. And I think that is the relevant difference, because physical force or threats, uncontroversially, are present in the case of coercion. They remove moral responsibility, and they're not present in the normal case where I do something freely, allegedly determined by God. So we have a nice refuting defeater here for the coercion case. And now we come to the most difficult one, which is the manipulation case. So for the manipulation case, what I've suggested in my work, and once again, it's just me sticking my neck out because I technically don't have to, but I think very much something like this is true. I think that in order to be morally responsible for what you do, the choice to do it needs to flow out of your God-given character and desires. Something like that must be true, and I think it's not all that controversial either, because a libertarian is perfectly welcome to affirm something like that. And an easy way to see that is to say, imagine that your choice is not flowing from your God-given character and desires. It seems like it's clearly being interfered with by something else that the incompatibilist is going to be inclined to say is removing your moral responsibility. So that condition, that condition of making a choice according to your God-given character and desires, I think is uncontroversially present. It's satisfied by the normal case on determinism, right? Because on determinism, I'm still freely choosing to do what I want. It's a choice that flows out of my God-given character and desires. But that is not satisfied by the strong manipulation case with maybe a mad scientist with electrodes in your forehead, because he is tampering with your God-given character and desire. Right? So there's a condition that is, we can see on the manipulation case, your choice is not flowing out of your God-given character and desire. I think we all agree that this excludes your moral responsibility. And I think we agree it's not the case in the normal determinist case. So it seems to me like we have a successful relevant difference between those two. Now, there's obviously some rejoinders. People can find issue with my characterization. Some people might also say, well, no, if you do, so you might, so that might be an arbitrary distinction, right? To say, well, just because God is doing it, what's the difference with the mad scientist? So there's a bit more to be said, but I think that's a very solid candidate for what the incompatibilist is asking with the manipulation argument, which is there a relevant difference? I think that's the one. And to defend slightly against the charge of arbitrariness, I would say that, yes, it can strike us as a little bit arbitrary to say, well, when the mad scientist is doing it on my brain, somehow it removes my moral responsibility, but it's just fine when it's God who controls my very thoughts and my inner makeup. And here what I would say is, to try to diffuse a little bit the intuition, is to say that the distinction between human beings, like a mad scientist or any sort of other human agent who would be removing your moral responsibility when tampering with your God-given desires, is massively different. There's a huge gap between human beings like that and the creator of the universe, who is the proper creator and maker of my own self. And so we can appreciate that there are lots of things that when we do them, it counts as something. And if God were to do it, it would be completely different. One example would be to take a life, for example. Right? So if I kill my wife, that's a murder, and it's wrong. If my wife's mom kills my wife, that's still wrong. That's still murder. If my children kill my wife, that's still wrong. So no matter who does it, it seems like it's murder. But if God takes her life today, we as Christians would be committed to saying, no, this is fine. He's the author of life. He's the one who's created her, and it's his prerogative to do that. So there are creator-creature distinctions. Go pronounce this with a French accent. These distinctions, I think, help us appreciate why it's so different when God is the one who's providentially controlling everything about me and is in providential control of the outcome of my choices in a way that preserves my moral responsibility, because he has appropriate access to my state of heart, my state of mind, and he has the liberty to change them how he pleases, as opposed to a human being who is now tampering with your God-given character and desires in such a way that your choice that's expressed is really not a reflection of your God-given character and desires, but a tempering of it by somebody else, and therefore removes your blameworthiness or praiseworthiness.